This is Only the Strong Survive, a podcast powered by Kahn Media, where we dive deep into the world of business, leadership, and innovation. I'm your host, Dan Kahn, and I'm honored to have you join us today. So, let's get ready to learn some survival skills together. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Only the Strong Survive, powered by Kahn Media. We have a really fun episode for you today. It's one we've wanted to do for a long time. If you are familiar with our parent company, Kahn Media, if you work in automotive aftermarket or in automotive media, you probably know this guy. He's been an integral part of the company and my right-hand guy for a lot of years, Cory Burns. So Cory is the Senior Vice President of Accounts here at Kahn Media. He was employee number 2. We actually worked together at a prior agency, and we'll probably get into all that today. But he has been a huge part of the growth of our company, and I've wanted to do this in person. It would feel weird to do it over Zoom since our offices are about 15 feet apart. So we've been just waiting to find the right time to do it. First of all, welcome to the show, Cory.
Stoked finally sat down and do this. I don't think we've ever had like a full narrative arc conversation.
No, and I think to set expectations for our listeners, we are certainly going to talk about the stuff we usually get into on these episodes. So we'll talk about business and leadership and personal development and growth. But this is a good opportunity. The first or second episode of season 1, Mike Spinelli and I got into a pretty in-depth conversation on the future of media. It was interesting because that episode came out about a year ago, and Mike was in sort of a transitional period of his career, and he's a mutual friend of yours and mine. And I was blown away because he made some big calls about what was going to happen. And if you haven't heard that episode, I recommend to go back and listen. It's episode number 1 or 2. A lot of what he predicted has come true. So, in the break between season 1 and season 2, Motor Trend sold to Hearst, which is pretty wild. People like David Freiberger got let go. And I mean, these are people that are pretty integral parts of that brand that kind of help build what they are currently. Most of our friends in the print publishing business have had some real challenges this year. The influencer thing has completely exploded. There's been a resurgence of some brands like Hemmings. It's been pretty wild. I mean, it's been a wild ride pretty much from the beginning till now, but the last year has been really, really transformative. So I think we'll get into some of that stuff too. And I think, early in the year now is a good time to make some predictions and see if we can make fools of ourselves.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll talk about PR, we'll talk about marketing, but first of all, Cory, tell us your story. How did you and I meet, and how do we get started on this?
Yeah, it's funny how you remember it, and then it's funny to get reminders about how like all these little things that sort of pave the way along the way. But early on, the guy we worked for first, Joe Molina.
Well, church, right?
Yeah, my folks' church. So I was 11, 12. And so Joe would show up to church with cool cars all the time. So I was like, oh, that guy likes cars. I like cars.
So this would have been like in the early 90s or mid 90s?
Probably, yeah, like mid 90s. Yeah, something like that, maybe late 90s. Because then I was born in 89. So probably early 2000s.
Okay. So it's in Joe Molina, for those people listening who don't know this. Cory started his career working for Joe. I joined his agency after a couple of other stints, and you guys have heard my story. But Joe ran an agency from, I think, around 78.
Yeah, pretty early.
He sold it, about 5 years ago?
Yeah.
And there was a period of about 20 years in that 40-year window where he was the dominant player in automotive PR. Like, he had Lamborghini, Ferrari, Ducati, Bentley, Bugatti.
Every major brand.
Meguiar's, Coker Tire, BFG for a while. I mean, like, now, in retrospect, we run an agency. Looking back at his client list, and even the clients that were competitive with each other that he had at the same time.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't think you could do today.
No, not at all.
What he was doing in the 90s. Like, he was the guy. So you're going to church, you're 10.
Yeah, and I'm 10 and I see this guy with all these cars. And so I was already a car nut. Like, that was, my dad, that's what I grew up with. That's what my dad kind of got me set on. And, I was just obsessed with it. So I'd started hanging out with the family and all this stuff. So I get older, I'm working at an auto parts warehouse, and my dad worked at a company called IMC. So I worked in the warehouse pulling parts, and that was my high school job. Worked at the bike shop on the weekends to be able to afford my mountain bike habit. So I just work off bikes at Spoken Wheel in the Valley. And I was working there, and Joe had hit me up and said, hey, my assistant's going to be out for 2 weeks. And I was already working at the warehouse, and he said, I'd love if you came in and helped me. Friend of the family. I was like, you know what? Sure. Like, let's go explore it. So I show up, and the first day I remember he goes, hey, can you go get my car washed? And he throws me the keys to his Bentley, and he had like a 2001 Arnage. And I remember driving that car to the car wash, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, but this is insane. And I call my dad, and I'm on my flip phone, and I call him and I go, Dad, I'm driving Joe's Bentley. And he goes, get the fuck off the phone. And And like that moment will probably has explained a lot of my maturing over the years. You know, I remember that moment being like, whoa, this is like a crazy thing that somebody was just like, here you go. You know, so I worked there, and for those 2 weeks while his assistant was out, and then he had mentioned, hey, you know, people at the office, you know, seemed to really like you. Have you thought about a job in PR? At the time, no idea what it was. I was going to school for gen ed stuff at community college, but really didn't have any like path. Lucky enough, I got to work under you when I first worked there. And I remember I understood the subject matter, but the whole process of learning, you know, really the PR trade. It was funny. I remember like we worked for McGuire's, and it was like we were early in forums, and it was like, oh, okay, this is like right, you know, it was like the next step before social, before any of that.
Oh, and you were kind of like a gopher. You were like an admin at first, like an intern.
Where I was doing random like
This is back when probably 75% of the client clips we got every month were in print.
right.
They were magazines, and then to some extent newspapers, and very little broadcast, very little online.
Right.
So we had a pretty robust library back then at JMPR.
Like a physical library, like a full magazine.
I remember you used to have to go pull clips, and you were filing magazines, and we would do this thing called distribution, where everybody had to read all the magazines, and you get these magazines with like a weird note on like a sticky, and like you'd come into work, and Joe had clearly been there over the weekend, and this Monday morning you got a stack of magazines in your desk with all these like sticky notes with like
Of like things to pitch.
like ideas, and so you were doing all that stuff, but you're right. I remember like on the McGuire's account, we just crushed it on print PR for them at the time, because they also spent a lot of money on advertising, which didn't hurt. I remember that, to the forum thing where it's like, okay, we have to seed the forums with posts about their new product.
And it was like, because like, I mean, you had grown up in forums and message boards and stuff like that, but it was like, how do we go on a forum and represent this brand? And this was specifically for their motorcycle line. So I was building out like a media list of like ZX14 forum or whatever it was. My name was like McGuire's like marketing guy. And like you went in there, and then you realize once you get shut down by enough admins, you're like, oh, you can't do this. It was a total Wild West. You don't know, but you go, oh, well, there's this whole untapped thing which has probably now been replaced by Facebook groups and all this other stuff. It was really interesting at the time because it was like this total unknown. We're like, you know what, let's give it a shot. I remember like going in, and I was like seeding products and packing them up to send out to editors. The whole process was totally manual.
Yeah, we had an extra office
Yeah.
full of product, and it was like
detailing stuff.
like literally just boxes of like quick detailer and microfibers and
Press kits from brands and all that stuff. It was interesting at the time, and like not seeing how it all comes back together. I'd scan clips, so I'd see like what the outcome was of what somebody else in the other office, a more senior employee, was doing, pitching some story or lining up a cover or whatever it was. So I could see sort of like the reward of that. And then I remember very intimately, like when I started, and it was like, oh, I'm pitching stories now. And it was like, okay, well, you build this list, you learn how to build a media list, and you start doing the research on what the outlets are. And then you package up and you write a press release, or you're just pitching one you got. And I remember there were a couple. We was working on McGuire stuff, and there was also, I was working with Galpin at the time, which is crazy that we're working with him.
Did you work on Callaway?
Not Callaway, but Mosler.
The M2900.
Yeah. So I remember I landed a story in Wired, and I remember he had a really hard to pronounce last name, but he worked there, Chuck Squatriglia. I can't believe I remember that. So he was somebody I pitched, and I remember like the feeling of that like first like thing that you did. You're like, oh, okay, I understand
The win.
now. The win.
You got the win.
And then I also remember, and Mark will laugh if he ever hears this, but like I remember calling Mark Vaughn, inviting him to like a car unveil event at Galpin, and he's like, oh, I can't make it that night. I'm going to be sticking needles in my eyes. And like I was like, wow, what a dick. But then at the time, you know, you don't realize like what you're asking of somebody when you're like, you know, I'm like maybe 20.
That was probably 18 or 19 years ago.
Yeah.
And I still remember that so vividly that when we sat down for this conversation, in my head, I said, I hope he tells the needles in the eyes story.
Yeah. And like, it's so funny. Mark and I have become great friends and ride motorcycles together and all this stuff now. But, you know, I'm like this 21-year-old kid, and I'm just like cold calling people. Like you never realize the relationships you were building over that time, because the second time you reach out, they go, all right, I'll listen. I'll hear you out. It was a really good experience for me. And I remember like the best advice I ever got from Joe was, it's not what you say, it's what you don't say. And it's funny like that it sort of comes around, and I sort of hear that in the back of my head all the time. And I think a lot of people that work there have like a Joeism from the era.
Sue me, please.
Yeah.
I had a lot of notes on the desk. See me PLZ. That was never good.
So there were like a ton of like ridiculous adventures and stuff. I was like weird personal stuff I was doing or whatever. But in the time that I worked there, I remember starting to like kind of get it. And it wasn't something like it came naturally in the sense that like I was a big media hound and I'm reading and I didn't grow up like that. My like magazine exposure was like mom takes me to the supermarket with her and I'm like, can you buy the DuPont registry so I can look at all the cars? So I remember that, my time there was like, oh, okay, like here's how I kind of navigate all of these different elements. And I wasn't going to events. I wasn't doing anything with press cars or anything. It was really just like really basic, like building blocks for like what the PR trade was. And, I remember working for you and Sanaz, and like we have all these, all these friends that are now still in the industry. Aaron Bronner, that's over at Bentley, like so many great people that we worked with at that organization.
There was 2 teams at that company, and I ran one, and we were more aftermarket and performance. We had the more performance-oriented cars and all the aftermarket stuff. And then the other team was more the luxury, is like Infiniti and Bugatti and all that. And it was interesting because my team had, at least we tried to have more enthusiasts. And the other team really wasn't car people. They were just PR people.
Yeah.
And then with respect, good PR people, very good PR people. Some that are probably better than me. But we were the car people. And you're right. Like if you look at all the people who came before us at that company, that were there when we were there, that came after us, I would say a significant number of people in senior leadership positions at OEMs in marketing and PR today, at some point, I did at least a year or 2 in that shop.
A ton.
And it's funny because when I left, and I know when you left, and we'll get into that a little bit, but Joe protected his turf pretty fiercely and it's got uncomfortable there for both of us with him for different reasons.
Right.
For years, and I think we've both come to good terms with him now.
Yeah, for sure. I still talk to him. Yeah.
Me too. And now that he's retired, I don't think he holds a grudge, and I think we've all become friends. And it is interesting. That was sort of a root that many branches have grown from.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it sort of made you have thick skin. Trial by fire was a thing that like that job in particular, it's not like there's some training manual on how to, like there's the basics of here's the skills you need to have to kind of do this. But like if you don't have interpersonal relationships skills and you don't have the ability to like actually convince somebody that something you have to say is important on the phone, you really learn how to develop that stuff there. And then like those cold calls for like new interns, like I remember people would come join and you like hear them on the phone and they're nervous and you're like, once you do it, you go, oh, okay, I get it. It preps you for a lot of maturing and a lot of, sort of your future.
And things are changing now. And it's interesting because the media landscape is changing, but for a long, long time, this is almost insulting to the people higher up the list. But if you look at lists of most stressful jobs, PR was always in the top 10.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's interesting because the other ones are like legitimately
intense,
physically stressed.
Firefighter,
military, police officer, where you're dealing with the worst of humanity, or you're seeing just gnarly, horrible things, or like, these are people that are dealing with like real physical stress.
Right.
Obviously, when you go into an office every day and you're working on a phone and a computer, no one's shooting a gun at you.
No.
Right? But having to serve many masters, you have many clients. Every client needs to feel like they're their only client. You're calling media who, for the most part, even if they're your friend, really don't want to talk to you, really don't want to buy what you're selling.
Don't have a reason to, really.
No, and then there's a gun to your head because you constantly you could make the biggest hit. I mean, I'll never forget for the rest of my career, towards the end of my time at JMPR, Airstream was one of our accounts. And as an RV guy, I was so proud to work on that account. It's American manufacturing icon, a legendary brand, beautiful product. The president, who's still the president all these years later, Bob, which is sort of surprising that, someone could last that long in a corporate environment. So clearly a very smart guy. I was so proud to work on that account. And we had got a lot of good hits, but it took a year to get Dan Neal to review one back when he was at the LA Times before he jumped to the Wall Street Journal. And we got him not on the cover of like the travel section or the weekend section. It was the cover, A1 above the fold, LA Times. It was up to that point the biggest hit of my career. I have never been prouder up to that point of anything in my life. And the next month we're on the phone with them and they're like, well, yeah, what'd you do for us this month? And I think that's a big part of this gig that people don't understand unless they've done it. Like,
yeah.
It's not like a normal job where like you have your sort of just show up and do your thing and run your spreadsheet and then you can just like go take a nap. Like every day
you're proving to somebody.
You have to prove that you deserve to exist.
Right.
And so what's interesting about the JMPR thing is I think Joe took a lot of hits over the years for his management style, and he was pretty harsh. And at the time I was not a fan. In retrospect, and you and I have talked about this a lot over the decades, I often now open my mouth and hear Joeisms come out.
Yeah.
And it used to shock me. I've gotten kind of used to it, but I didn't understand at the time what it was that he was trying to do and what it was that he was going through. And what's interesting, I think, is it was so high pressure there. You and I, and we're going to talk about this, I hope, today. We've worked a lot on culture. Our culture is very different today than it was even a couple of years ago, and it's extremely different than it was in the early days. For better or for worse, he created a boot camp that most people washed out, and they would usually wash out within a few months.
Yeah.
If they made it a year, they're probably still doing this for a living today. And I think it's like you just had to build up some armor, and you had to figure out how to be resilient enough to pick up that phone. Someone's going to say, I'd rather stick needles in my eyes than go to that show. And instead of being like, shit, and like you give up, you just get up the next day and do it again. And that is a skill set.
It was interesting too, because I think here, and like I have so much contrast to compare it to now, the opportunity for like experience, like there, you were pretty much in office most of the time. Maybe you were going to a meeting, or maybe you were doing an event.
Oh yeah, no, it was like 95%.
Or like 95% was in the office. So like you had to figure out what brought you joy if in that gig, and some people never found it, and others went like, oh, okay, cool. Like I really like these certain clients. Like we weren't doing Zoom. We were like actually driving to businesses and doing meetings. And like, I remember when clients would come in and it was like, oh, here's how we present who we are to this client. And, when they walk in the door and they see the sign on the desk and they're greeted and we brand everything. So it looks, it was like, but it was that whole kind of that show element that made you realize how to sort of highlight your dedication to the brands that you were working with. And so I think if you took away anything from that, that was pretty formative, at least in like my understanding of like the sort of basics of the gig.
So you're working there, you went from intern to account coordinator, and around the time you got promoted, I left.
Yeah.
And I've talked about that on past episodes. We don't need to rehash that. But I leave, I have an idea for a digital first agency. I start in my bedroom at my house, and I think about 5 or 6 months in, I realize I need help. So I go to this little office park in Reseda, because that was literally the only thing I could afford. And if you're not from SoCal, Reseda's a mixed bag. This office park was a mixed bag. We had a porn production company next door on one side. We had a weed grow operation on the other side.
Clock was always on 420.
Clock was always on 420 next door. Our office, I did not know this at the time. I found this out like a year in, was the first American office for Al Jazeera. So whatever, but it was $1,100 a month, and that's what I could afford. So I leased that first little office. I needed help. So the first hire was, I just put an ad out, and Alana Shear, who has now gained a fair amount of fame and notoriety because she went to Hot Rod and then Roadkill and then Car and Driver now. She's been the Car and Driver for several years now, and she's now got quite the following and has built a great career for herself. So she was employee number one and was kind of doing everything. She showed up in her Polara, or no, that was in her Challenger before Polara, for the interview, and she was sort of an account exec and a art director and an admin, and we had this guy named Dennis who was like our part-time video guy, but she was really full-time employee number one. And within I think probably a month or two, I was like, we need more help. And I don't remember what happened.
Facebook message. I had just left JMPR, and it was a Facebook message. I knew you were doing your own thing, and I remember sending you, I asked you about the 4th gen because you had the Camaro at the time, and I was like, oh, how's the Camaro? We were just kind of bullshitting on Facebook Messenger, and you wrote back, and I was like, hey, and we got into a conversation like, hey, are you hiring? And I came in and I started all over again, and I was an intern again.
Yep.
Having a paid internship was pretty cool. So I left like everything and like just went in.
You're at the front desk for a while.
Yeah, I was like a receptionist and an intern and whatever, like weird porn DVDs the neighbors would bring over.
Not at my request. They just did that.
Weird neighbors would pop in, and
that was a weird place.
It was a weird place.
This was like 2009, and that was the early days of CrossFit. And that was not like a known thing yet.
Yeah.
So we had the porn guys on one side. We had the weed grow guys on the other side.
Cat tree people.
We had people making cat trees across the aisle. And then we had this CrossFit gym, but no one knew what CrossFit was. So we had all these like really buff dudes wearing parachutes, running in circles in the parking lot. I mean, it looked like an insane asylum. It was
like new. I remember asking like, why would people sign up for a gym just so they could run in a parking lot? That was the mystery of our time.
And you want to talk about company culture. I look back on that first couple of years, and then you brought in your friend Alex.
Yeah.
Because Dennis decided our video guy didn't want to be the video guy anymore. He wanted to go sell insurance. So you had a friend who did video, and he came in, and you two
unhinged,
completely unhinged. We would get an explicit rating on this show if I got into details about the stuff you guys would say and do. But poor Alana, like what she was subjected to with you two idiots, like it was so wildly inappropriate. I would 100% get sued if that stuff was going on today. Like the stuff you guys said and did was unbelievably inappropriate.
We were like horrible friends together first, and then Yeah.
Also like 12 of you, 20?
Yeah, 22 maybe.
Yeah. So just completely unhinged.
I think what was interesting is I remember like going to 341 Challenge, right? And like,
So explain what that is.
yeah, so we put on a hill climb event at
Our first big client. So we had Hotchkiss Suspension was our first client. Redline Oil, which when it was still in Pelion, Cameron Evans was our second client. And Cameron, who I talked to him a couple days ago. He's still a good friend, and we still talk to this day. That company sold several times. We kept it all the way until it went to Phillips 66. Our third client, I took an ad out. I had never advertised before in Help a Reporter Out, HARO, which was a mailing list that Peter Shankman, who was a PR guy, put together, where it was like a listserv. All these reporters would go to Peter and say, I need a source. I'm writing an article on PTSD, and I need a psychologist who specializes in PTSD or whatever. I need a car guy who can talk about how not to get ripped off at the car dealership or whatever. And he'd put these lists together and he'd blast them out to like 50,000 PR people. And you'd say, oh, I've got a client for that. And then you could email the journalist and say, I've got a source for you. And for not very much money, it was a lot of money at the time, like, $1,000 or something. I bought one of his first ads, and it was for our agency. And it was when it was just me and Alana. Ori Rosenbaum, who owns a shoe company called Ori, reached out to me and said, hey, my brother owns a company called Spectre Performance, and they make a lot of the chrome parts in the AutoZone like performance aisle, and he needs help. You should talk to him. And he introduced us to Amir, who I need to get on the show because Amir,
he has the best stories.
Brilliant and a wild man. And so he's on the list. We got to get Amir. So he hired us, and Spectre was our first big client.
Yeah, for sure.
We did all their PR. We did all their social. We did a lot of marketing consulting. I was driving out to Ontario like once a week. Video work. They were our biggest account we'd ever had up to that point. And he came up with this idea to produce a hill climb event in Nevada.
And it was based on, I remember like the Ferrari Club used to go out there and do it.
Yeah, I think the Ferrari Club and the Shelby Club.
Yeah.
And for those who've never heard of this area, so in Nevada, kind of outside of Reno, there's this town in the mountains called Virginia City and another town called Silver City. And they're both like old mining towns from the 1800s in the mountains, and they're kind of separated by, do you remember the distance?
It was maybe 10 miles.
I was gonna say 9 or 10 miles. And the original road was this super twisty, super technical road with like crazy 1,000-foot drop-offs, no guardrails. That's probably 75 years old or something. And then at some point in the last 30 or 40 years, they built a trucking route, so an alternate route. So these two towns were connected by these two parallel roads that are a couple miles apart. One is big and straight and multi-lane and safe, and one is very twisty and not safe. And so what the Ferrari and Shelby Club used to do, they would pay the town to use the trucking route and leave it open because it's a 2-lane road. They would shut down the technical road. So you would race up the hill from Silver City to Virginia City on a closed course, haul ass, both lanes, closed road, and then you come back down the return road on the truck route. Ironically, Amir had all these fond memories of doing this earlier in his career where he was in the Ferrari Club, and he really wanted to own the track record. And he's such a wild man that I think at the time he had a Testarossa, and this is in like the 80s.
Yeah.
So he bought a brand new F40, had it race prepped, big intercoolers, big turbos, slicks, leased a house in Virginia City, hired a driving coach, and would run it at night when it was not closed to learn the course and set the course record until this guy came over from Germany with a highly modified 911 turbo named Alois Roof, and Roof spanked him.
Foreshadowing.
And then Amir started going back with more private coaches, and then all of a sudden Amir and Alois had this rivalry for a couple of years. All these years later, Roof is still our client.
Which is nuts.
And which is crazy. And the Yellowbird, and that's a whole other story. But first of all, just on a sidebar, I think we all feel the same way about the Roof family. They're
the coolest people.
The sweetest, nicest, best people.
Everybody that I know that has met them or spent time with them feels the same way.
Yeah.
I've never met a group of people that can show up in a room and just
light it up.
People fall in love with them.
Yes. They are the most charming, affable, warm, wonderful people. And they build an amazing car. Like the best car I've ever driven. All of our clients, everything else, all due respect, Roof CTR, does not get any better. So Amir gets this idea that he's going to bring it back, and it's going to be the Spectre 341 Challenge.
And I remember we invited media. We helped them get cars. Mark Gillies came the first year. That was at Car and Driver at the time. That's now, I think, at Volkswagen.
I think so, yeah. And they came like to win.
Yeah. Showed up when the Viper ACR, not the last one, but the gen before that.
Yeah.
And he showed up in factory ACR and like
On slicks.
I think Aaron Robinson was there in a CTSB wagon that was fairly new at the time.
And do you remember the other big great? So Gillies with the ACR, we thought was cool. Lou Gelati, who at the time was, I think, a 3 or 4 time Grand Am champion.
C6 ZR1, I think.
ZR1 with like, was it a C5 or a C6?
C6, because it was very new. And we were all like, oh my God, like I've never
Also like big boost, slicks.
Aero.
And then the one that blew my mind, this was all year one,
Yeah.
was, I don't know if you know what I'm going to say.
Was it Millen?
It was Millen.
Oh yeah, the R35 was new.
It was brand new. Most people had never even seen an R35 GTR.
I lost my mind. I remember I was like, I just want to look.
And Steve Millen shows up, and he had prepped the car for the Targa Tasmania. And I think the only thing they had done, no drivetrain mod.
Nope.
They just gutted the car. And I think he said they took like 1,000 pounds out of it.
And they were doing like product development for it and stuff too.
It was too new.
It was a mule.
So they have this like super lightweight, hardcore. And here's a guy from a family that is like the most legendary Pikes Peak.
Yeah, they're the Hill Climb family.
So he shows up with this like unobtainium race prep GTR. So, I mean, there were some hitters.
And we like took over the parking lot of the only hotel in town, and it's just full of like pro touring cars and all this other random stuff. And I remember it was like the fact that we were basically producing a race
with FM3. That's how we got to know Jimmy Wally, who we still work with this day. They were doing race prep and event production. We're doing all social, all video. We brought out Antonio Alvanita. We brought out Larry Chen.
Well, no, Larry was year 2. Mike Burrows was the first year. So Mike came and covered it for Stanceworks.
So all these are like super famous photographers now.
And Mike's doing like killer content on YouTube and all this stuff now. But like at the time, it was like, we want them to capture this. And because Antonio had Motor Mavens, he was shooting for Speed Hunters too at the time.
Yep.
And so like, I remember that.
And I think Rod was he was like the art director.
Yeah, he was. He was running point on it.
So he was assigning people. And I mean, that was early days. And we were putting journalists in pro touring cars. We had Cam Douglas from Optimus.
That's right.
Camaro pro touring car.
And a bunch of the Spectre cars, like they had the Maverick with the 2J in it.
Yep.
They had a bunch of
the wide body El Camino.
Yeah, wide body El Camino. And so like people were jumping in and out of stuff, which was wild. I remember we were basically hosting media up there that they were actually racing the event.
And I remember the media and the guests all got to stay in this nice hotel, the only nice hotel. There were not enough rooms for us. So you, me, Alana, our video team, we got to stay in these shacks.
We're like down the road.
That were like these like wooden like shanties. And I don't know if yours did. My door, I remember at the end of the day, I closed the door, had bullet holes in it. And I'm sitting in my bed, and I see shafts of light coming through the bullet holes. And I'm like, yeah, sick. Okay. All right. So I think at this point, we got to tell the story because so many people have asked to tell the story. I think we need to tell the story of what happened on the first 341. So rewind to the Reseda office.
Yeah, Reseda office.
We announce it.
We announce the event. A guy reaches out to us, to Kahn Media, and asks if he can come out and take us to lunch.
And this is in the early days. And by the way, we've staked our entire reputation at this point as we're going to be the digital first automotive agency, PR agency, marketing agency. No one else was doing that. No one had internal video production. Nobody was working on, branded content. We were the first company to do that in automotive. And this is pre-YouTube.
Yeah.
So
Street Fire at the time.
Street Fire was where, so we were already spending time in forums, Facebook, early days of Facebook, and Street Fire, which predated YouTube in terms of automotive content. So
VR Alexander was a name that if you look it up, you'll find the stories about it. But he reached out to us and said, hey, can I come take you guys out to lunch? I'm going to come race the race. And it was early on. I think we had just started working with HRE. And so HRE had sponsored the car.
The thing about VR Alexander, which is a handle on Street Fire, is he was the first real viral automotive video guy. So he was Cletus before there was a Cletus.
And he was doing like wild
stuff.
Speeding all over public roads.
And keep in mind, I don't condone any of this now. 15, 20 years ago, like one of his videos early on that got like 7-figure views was he had a GTR, he had a Carrera GT.
Yeah.
It was an early production Carrera GT. And he was going like $150 on a freeway somewhere in California, and he outran a police helicopter on camera. Now, again, 2025.
Yeah, bad plan.
Don't do that.
Yep.
But at the time, that was wild. And so
It
he
was like the Ghost Rider videos, but for car people.
yeah, so that goes on. So like that's who this guy was. No one knew what he looked like. Nobody had ever met him before.
But he reached out and he's like, hey, can I take you guys to lunch? Knowing he was coming to the event. So Alana and I went to lunch with him and we went to that little Mexican restaurant down the street. And we were like, okay, well, this guy is so nice. He bought us lunch and he was so nice and everything was cool. So we're like, oh, great. Well, stoked to have you up there. We'll see you in a couple months.
Signed up for the race.
Signed up for the race. Came out to do it. So we get there, we see him up in Virginia City, say hi in the parking lot, and he's prepping his car. I think his wife was there at the time.
Fiance.
And yeah, and we're all going like, oh, this guy's like a super nice guy.
Very affable guy.
Really cool to us, all this stuff.
Kind of looked like a big Russian dude. He had like kind of dark hair, Serbian. I think he was Serbian.
Yeah.
So he showed up and we explained who you're competing against. I'd say half the crowd were pro touring guys. So
Yeah.
well-meaning, 65 Chevelles and 71 Camaros with pro touring suspension and
Big LS motor.
an LS motor and a 5-speed and very cool cars. Probably not going to beat a Viper ACR or a GTR lightweight. They're there to have a good time. You had a handful of cars that are like the players that we just described. Ironically, I think one of the consistently fastest cars the 2 years we did the event was a local guy named Jeremy, and I can't remember his last name.
Jeremy, and he had a white Evo.
A white Evo. It was an Evo 9 and it had good tires and big brakes, and I think
Big power. Like
maybe like a big turbo. If I might remember correctly, it wasn't that the car was so heavily modded, it was that he was a local.
and he was fast.
So he really, really knew the line. And he used to run it just like Amirba did back in the day. He used to run it at night when it was an open road. So he was just a better driver. And so he was kicking butt.
Like top 3.
But the rest of the guys out there really didn't know what was going on. And VR Alexander shows up and he had I think it was a 996 heavily modded to the point that I was making like 900 horsepower, humongo turbos, giant intercoolers, big wheel and tire package.
It was pretty serious. And like that was like before a lot of the like big, sort of Euro tuning brands really were out there in that space. And so I remember he came out super nice.
You're 22, you're a year in, none of us knows what we're doing.
No, but we're making sure everybody, all the journalists are there having a good time. We're shooting content, whatever. First race day comes around and I'm a corner worker. And it was actually, we had one race day. This is before we had the practice runs.
Amir put everybody in a motorhome.
Yeah, that's right.
So he could give all the drivers, the driver, the track talk and show them the line in like a diesel pusher motorhome.
Doing a canyon in a Prevost with like 20 people was pretty weird.
But I mean, he was very clear about like no guardrails and this is sketchy. In that first year, we were timing it 2 ways. We had timing equipment for total elapsed time of your run from the starting line to the finish line. And this is the part where in retrospect, bad plan. We had a radar gun on the end of the straight, which the straight was maybe 1/8 of a mile. It wasn't very long. At the end of the straight was a hairpin. And so we did tell people we were going to be checking terminal speed in the straight. Most people didn't care about that.
No.
They were just looking to like drive a good line, have fun, be safe, maybe get a good ET. But early on, VR announced like all-wheel drive, twin turbo, I want to set fastest speed of the event, which foreshadowing, in retrospect, bad plan.
One of the things, I mean, you just kind of did whatever you did back then. So it's like some people were down at the start, like I was the corner worker. So I ended up going up with a walkie-talkie and I'm up on turn 12, right where that was. So race runs are coming up all day and we're radioing up, hey, car goes by. Sure enough, he comes around the corner and I'm like, oh, here comes Joe Alexander, curious how fast he's going to go. And he comes up and he stops. And I go, what is he doing? And he builds that boost, dumps it, and just hauls ass. That thing pulled so hard, hauls ass and misses the turn, locks him up, misses the turn and flies off the cliff. And I'm just sitting there on the corner and I'm going, holy shit, like what did I just see? So it's like, okay, cool. Everything's done for the day. Call it in. I'm waiting up there. Car's down there, flipped over, smoking. And I'm like, dude, like we got to get fire up here. EMS, everybody starts coming up. They go down there and we get the news like, he's dead. And it was like, you spend so much time around motorsports and you don't really think about it that much because you're just like, well, like cars are fun and this is what you do. But there is like this inherent danger in doing that thing. I don't know, gave us like a reference point to like, whoa, like there's some liability here. And it was like a crazy moment. And I remember watching it. It didn't didn't really sink into later, but it was like a super crazy thing to happen, early in your job.
Yeah, and for those listening, we're not making light of this. I mean, when someone loses their life in an event or a race that you're involved in, it's tragic. And that was, I think, for both of us, for different reasons, one of the hardest things we've ever had to go through in our entire careers. I don't want to speak for you, but I know that was traumatic for you.
Yeah, it was.
You were the only one who saw it.
Yeah, because you got so many turns up there, and so you're just solo. It wasn't just somebody I didn't know either. It was somebody who I felt like, oh, he's such a nice guy, and I'm learning all this stuff. So I know. Fast forward, you had to go tell them news.
And this was sort of, I think, the reason I wanted to share the story, besides the fact it's a crazy story, is it was really, I think, what brought you and I a lot closer together, because we went through something so incredibly challenging that on the backside of that, there's really only two options. Either you quit and say, screw it and move on and find a new job, or you realize, well, if I can deal with that, because that's about the worst thing a PR person in automotive or motorsports is going to deal with. So yeah, he passed away, and we found that out fairly quickly. And then Amir came to me and said, okay, well, his fiance is back at the hotel and she doesn't know what happened. So we got to go notify her. I'm like, you mean you have to go notify her? He's like, no, we have to go notify her. You're the PR guy. Come on. I'm like, okay. So we go, and it went from tragic to a Sopranos episode in about 2 minutes, because we showed up at the room and things got real crazy, because what we found out after the fact was he was, to us personally,
the
nicest guy ever.
100%.
As it turns out, kind of a sketchy dude. I think the Carrera GT that he had done the famous video in was stolen. There was a lot of accusations floating around behind the scenes that a lot of the cars that were in his videos were stolen.
I'm like, there was all these accusations of like him conning people and
con job stuff and borrowing cars and then not giving them back, which I guess is technically theft. And I don't remember his car, what the story was behind that, but there was something sketchy. And we get to the room, and the fiance, admittedly, you go through something like that, you're going to have a traumatic reaction. And I can't judge because I've never been something like that. But immediately, and her mom lived in Reno. So she started melting down and started hitting the vodka really hard, really fast. The mom showed up within about half an hour. And about the time her mom showed up, two things happened. She started pulling out a lot of hard drugs in front of us, and Amir, who's like super straight laced, and neither one of us knew how to handle that. Then the mom starts searching the bags, and we're like, what are you doing? And she's like, well, they always have a lot of guns. And she starts pulling handguns out of the suitcases and trying to keep the guns away from the lady, and she's waving a pistol around. And all of a sudden, Amir's wife, who is of Serbian descent, is trying to notify this guy's parents who are in Serbia. I mean, it got crazy. It was so crazy. And then the founder of Street Fire flew in because he knew him, and he's trying to like manage this whole situation because it would blow back on him, and he was friends with the guy. I mean, it was so nuts.
It went so many directions that we never thought it could go.
No, I mean, it was crazy, but we made it through.
And we did year 2.
And then we did it again.
And we did year 2. And it was interesting. Mir's like, yeah, I want to do it again. He's like, that is a thing that happens in motorsport. And was like, look, but I think enough people enjoyed it. And year 2 was when, we were working with Lindbergh a lot. We asked Lynn, because we worked with him a lot, and we're like, hey, could you come shoot the event? And he's like, I can't do it, but I have my buddy Larry. And I was like, sick, cool. If Lindbergh says you're good, then you're good. And Larry Chen comes out and shoots 2012.
First time we had ever worked with Larry, and this skinny kid at the time shows up with this big head of hair and this huge smile. And by the end of the weekend, that was it.
We're like, we're gonna hire Larry for everything. We loved it.
And like, all these years later, we still work with him every single time we can. I think that's probably the best takeaway of that whole drama saga.
Yeah, for sure.
It connected us with Larry. By the way, that is a great episode if you haven't heard it. The Larry Chen interview, go back and listen. Early on season 1 of OTSS. Good episode.
He came over the break, and like we went out to the range, and like he was sending me pictures from like Irwindale, like in like 2010, like when I first started, we were working for replay cameras or something. And like I look like a newborn, but I'm like, dude, have we known each other like 15 years? Like, and you look back, and I'm like, it's cool because he opened the doors for me a lot, sort of in things I was already interested in, which is a lot of JDM stuff. And he like took me to my first drift event, invited me to All-Star Bash. And that's how I met like Brandon Scarpelli, like somebody, that we both know. And I met all these really like great people in the industry, Mike Essa and all these people that now over the years, it's really cool that like these like little moments where you got to meet somebody sort of formed a whole career of, you know, kind of being in this industry, which is pretty neat.
So fast forward, you know, from what was that, 2009, 2010, little office in Reseda. Let's see, we moved to this office about 12 years ago.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, now we're what, 30 people, and 2 agencies, and coming up on your 15 year.
Yeah, 15 in March, which is nuts.
You know, you worked your way up to SAE and then account soup and then VP and then SVP. And, you know, we'll get into the PR stuff too, because I want to talk about that. But you've really, your whole career, other than a little bit of time working at the warehouse at IMC, you've really only worked for 2 companies. You did a couple of years at JMPR and then you've worked here.
I think I look at it not as like tenure with a company, but more about like my network of like people is always continuing to grow. And like I take a lot of pride in like long-term friendships and like in my personal life. And so I look back at like the people I still talk to and all, like, you know, like we've been friends for 20 years, 22 years. I look at it as an investment. And I think it's an investment of my time. And I think out of everything else, it is an investment of my time, willing to go, not just like, hey, I'm going to call you on the phone when I need something, but I actually like want to have legitimate friendships with people because we're lucky to work in an industry where we're so many awesome people. So much of that has opened up opportunities for me over the years just to be a part of something or get invited to an event or whatever it is. And like that turns into something else. So I always look at it as like take every opportunity to just try something new and just show up in a place where maybe you're uncomfortable. Because I remember like being the kid cold calling on the phone and show up somewhere and have somebody intro you, ask somebody what they're into, ask them about what they do. And you never know, A, who you're going to meet, B, how you're going to sort of like grow as a human. So I think that's been like probably my biggest takeaway. That's the thing that I still find the most fun. Showing up somewhere and maybe not knowing that many people and leaving going like, oh, I met this dude that does X, or, oh, here's this other industry I'm totally interested in. And now I have a way into that. So it's been neat.
If I can make an observation, you tell me if I'm right or wrong. I've had people ask me over the years to know how long you and I have worked together. And it's interesting because in a lot of ways we have similar personalities and we've done like disc assessments and stuff. And we're actually very similar, which could be good or could be challenging, kind of depending on the scenario. And people have asked like, you know, how the dynamic works. And one of the things that I've often thought and occasionally have said is you and I are motivated by different things. I'm the first to say I am an okay PR guy. I don't think I'm all that great at PR. What I really like is I like solving problems. That's what makes me happy at the end of the day is if I can look back on my day and know that I fixed something or solved a problem, that's what motivates me. And my observation of you, and I'm not sure if you'd agree with this or not, is it looks like I think you like 2 things. I think you definitely like interacting with people and relationships. And I think you also like collecting experiences.
Totally. That's the only thing that you should spend your time on is experiences.
Yeah. So like you like collecting experiences and making friends and being social. I like solving problems. And that's where I think our partnership works is I'm the guy in the background trying to figure out the next problem. You're the front guy making connections, making friendships, going on those. To be half the time, I'd rather not.
Yeah. Well, because you're like an introvert.
I am an introvert that can pretend to be an extrovert as needed. And so you like doing that stuff. I find it exhausting.
I tell my wife that too. Just because, what's planned for this week or this weekend or whatever. And I'm like, oh, well, I always got to have something to do.
And I am the opposite. I bitch and moan where I'm like, can we just have one weekend without any plans? Can I just like sit in a room and be left alone? One thing I did want to talk to you about is leadership. Because that is, you know, neither of us went to business school. And I've talked about that a lot on this show. You know, I don't have an MBA. You know, you didn't go to business school. I didn't go to business school. Neither one of us had like formal training on how to run a company, how to run a team, how to lead people. I think you and I have both had a pretty wild arc that continues, at least for me.
It can't stop.
Every day I gotta, take a gut punch and then have to figure out how to fix it. And, what has that been like for you? What, as you look back on your career, what have you learned and what do you want to learn? And what's been the hardest thing for you? And
I think probably if I had to look at it overall, I'd say that it feels like a sort of passing of the torch. Those experiences that I love so much that this career has enabled me to have, I now get a lot of joy of watching somebody else do that. And I think that was sort of when I found out I kind of transitioned to really be like learning how to be a leader. I won't say I'm perfect in any way, but I think I know what those things meant to me. So like when a press car is here and somebody's taking it to, a delivery and like gets to spend time and actually like use the product, which we very seldom got to do at the other agency.
yes,
I think that is a thing that like I enjoyed so much and that I love watching other people now get to enjoy those things and fill their life with those moments where they're like, man, I can't believe I got to get behind the wheel of that, or whatever it was, or go on the trip to Italy to go to a press event or whatever it is. So I think that was sort of the transitional moment for me. And it took me a long time to remind myself that I don't have to be the guy.
I think that also comes with maturity.
Yeah, but you have to learn it. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway. And I also think that time is the best thing that you can give somebody, because it's not necessarily whether or not you solved a problem in a meeting or you went and fixed it right away, or you were the person that had to fix it, but you gave them time to walk through their thoughts and then found something that helped them solve it. And I think that's probably what I've learned is people value most, that you'll sit down with them. And I think you've done a really good job over the years also to be like, hey, open door policy. Like, you say that all the time, but you actually mean it. If somebody has a thing they want to come to you with, I think a lot of other CEOs are CEOs, and they're always like this. It's a gift and a curse, right? But I also think it says a lot about the people that have worked here for a long time, that you've made time for them to help them walk through stuff. And I take a lot of pride in the fact that I go, no, I have to. It's okay. Don't say you're too busy. Make the time to let somebody come in and chat and like actually, maybe solve something, and they can leave feeling better and that they've grown too. So
That's really smart. And, it's interesting because on one hand, I used to be guilty of saying this. And in retrospect, I now have new thoughts about it. But I used to be one of the people who'd be like, oh, we're like a family. We're a family. No workplace is a family. And by the way, if someone's telling you that, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
And I used to say that, and it was a red flag. We're not a family, right? Like if at the end of the day, the business is the business. And if something catastrophic happens and you lose a massive account and your revenue goes down by 30% overnight, you might have to let a couple of people go. Well, you're not going to execute your kid. It's not a family, right? And on the flip side, in a family, you're going to tolerate stuff from a family member that you wouldn't tolerate in the workplace. When an employee shows up and does something horrible, that's not going to work either. So that's so not true. And I used to say that, and I'm guilty of it. And I've learned over the years that's not true. That said, what you're describing, I think there is an element of that in there, where as a parent, I used to want to do all the things. And now I see with my own kids, like personally, all due respect, no offense, Disney companies, not an amusement park fan. I would much rather be out in a forest somewhere than going to an amusement park. But I will take my kids to Disneyland because it makes them happy. And giving them that experience and seeing that joy, for me, is worthwhile, even though I personally don't like it. I'm going to go because it makes them happy. And so there is an element of that as a leader, where if you can give someone that gift, and I think you're exactly right. Like when we sent Kevin, we didn't send him. He earned it.
yeah,
Kevin earned the right to go on a press trip to Italy. Like, to me, him going on that trip is 1,000 times better than you or I going on that trip.
100%.
And we've had so many of this. Like a more recent example is at SEMA this year. We got invited to the Roaster Shop party. We've gotten to know those guys a little bit. Respect to those guys. I think they do a really cool job running their company. And obviously we've had Jeremy and Josh on and Phil on, and they invited us to their party. So we brought Mike from the team, and watching Mike walk around that show and meet all of his car builder heroes. Right. The dude was levitating. He was so stoked to be there.
100%.
He was so pumped that it made me pumped. And look, it's the end of the day. You're towards the end of the show. It's Thursday.
You're exhausted.
You're exhausted. We've done at that point, 20 press conferences or something, and had 80 meetings, and everybody's cooked. And there was a part of me that's like, dude, I just want to go back to my room and go to bed. But watching his reaction, I was like, this is totally worth it. This is awesome. So I totally agree with you on that. I think it's great. How do you think our culture has changed over the last couple of years? Because it feels to me like there's been a big shift.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that stands out the most is we have a lot of really, really smart people that work for us. Like, the things we have interest in, we can't know everything about every medium and about everything. So I think the best change, is that we've hired a bunch of people who have knowledge on a bunch of different subject matters, and also, with different marketing backgrounds, and with people who are into photography and video and making content. And I think the fact that we've hired people to strengthen the brand, but also to learn from them, as opposed to, I think, a lot of companies where it's like, you come in, you do it our way. And I think the fact that we've given people room to do it their way is probably the biggest change.
No, I never thought of that. And you're right. Our policy used to be, this is the way we've always done it. And we have completely ended that.
Treating every brand that we work with too, everybody has a different learning style. The way you work with people is vastly different too. I think probably that's the biggest change. And the people that work here are from all different walks of life. They're from all different interests. And I think that's what makes it really cool. It's there's somebody that knows something about that particular subject matter that helps bring value to something else that we're doing, which is cool.
I agree. And I've thought a lot about this. And I think three things have impacted that all kind of happen simultaneously and are all interconnected. I think the first thing that happened in a weird way is COVID.
Yeah, for sure.
Because before 2020, when we were hiring people, they had to be very local. Because people from outside think we're in LA. We're not actually in LA. We're like an hour north.
So I say that, like, you were 45 minutes north of actual Los Angeles.
We're kind of in the sticks if you live in LA, right? Most people at the time weren't going to commute from like Orange County to Ventura County, which in traffic is a 2.5, 3 hour drive. It was kind of hyper local. So we really limited our pool of people we could hire from, right? As soon as we were forced to go remote, and now we're in this kind of weird hybrid remote thing, we can hire people from wherever. Right. So that opened up a talent pool that we never had before. So that was one thing. It was hard. You and I had to figure out how to manage remote people, which we'd never done before. How to hire.
Yeah.
How do you sort out a good employee from a bad employee over Zoom? That sometimes is hard.
Learn a lot from like body language and stuff that you.
How do you manage somebody? Like what do you can you count on them to do what they say they're going to do? It's all trust based now, right? So COVID was, I think, the first thing. The second thing, all due respect to those who have gone, is we started implementing a pretty strict no assholes policy, where up until a few years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, we tolerated people because they had worked here a long time, they had a certain skill set, that were also kind of jerks. And it was feedback I got all the time. And also it impacted me too, because if you got someone who's thorny and prickly and maybe not very nice, but they're good at their job, you kind of deal with it. And it didn't occur to me at the time how damaging that is.
Yeah, for sure.
That, the people that work with that person, and there was a few of them, weren't having a great time because they weren't being allowed to be creative. They weren't being allowed to come up with their own ideas. They were being intimidated. I didn't understand how damaging that is. And to be honest, I was a jerk too for a while. And like I had to work on myself and took a lot of time working on that. And I've talked about that on the show. So once I started trying to soften my approach, I really started to realize we really shouldn't have assholes here. So let's have a no assholes policy. So we started weeding out all the assholes. So I think that was the second thing.
It's huge.
And then the third thing is once we got opened up to people who work from anywhere and we started weeding out the jerks, we started bringing in all this new talent. And so like for the first time, we had a new director of finance who's not only a lovely human being, but really creative and good at his job. Well, suddenly we can do financial forecasting, which we did never do before. Suddenly we have much more accurate P&Ls. Suddenly we can figure out the profitability of teams, not just for the whole company. Well, all of a sudden, we become a much more grown-up, profitable company. And what that allowed us to do was hire better people. So now we're bringing in the people you're talking about, where we're getting people with more experience, more diverse skill sets, more diverse viewpoints. We're bringing in people that are experts on different types of marketing, on branding, on creative, on video, on graphic design, on digital marketing. And we're bringing in all these smart, sophisticated, talented people. All of a sudden, you and I don't have to run every program for every account. We can say, hey, I know a lot about this. I don't know anything about that. Like, I don't know anything about that particular, whether it's a rebrand or I have my opinions, and I've been marketing for 20 years, so I've got some idea, but you want to ask me about the proper modality for an automated email drip system through a CRM, I am not your guy.
Right.
But we have people that are great at that. So I think those three things really have changed the whole culture here.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting too. Like, it also feels now like everybody at the company rows in the same direction. And so you have a camaraderie that you build because you've given people enough space to go, all right, cool. Like, you do it your way. It's been really, really cool to watch that develop and like watch people rise. That's another, like, I get a lot of joy out of that. I like watching people succeed.
So Cory Burns, now we'll talk about the dicey one because we're about an hour in. So you have been shouting from the rooftops for longer than almost anyone I know. Traditional media landscape is collapsing. Independent media is coming for all of it. PR is changing in such a dramatic way, it'll be unrecognizable. I mean, you've been saying it for like, 6 years?
Yeah.
Like a long time. And obviously a lot of that has happened. So where are we at today and where's this all going?
I think it's a couple things. I won't get political, but this election cycle was a really interesting opportunity to watch that change in reality. You have a golf content creator, Bryson DeChambeau, had Donald Trump on to play golf with him on YouTube. Doesn't have anything to do with politics. They're just going to go play golf. They didn't talk about politics. They just played golf. But the fact that a U.S. presidential candidate went and joined a popular YouTuber, whether or not his fan base voted for him or likes him or whatever, it's so shocking that that moment happened on a medium like YouTube.
watching him sit with Theo Vaughn
100%.
and listen to Theo Vaughn talk about doing coke. Like, that was the weirdest. I'm watching that whole thing going like,
Total Twilight Zone.
I cannot believe this is happening. I don't really understand it. Is this good? Is this at the time,
It doesn't really matter.
it was wild. And in the meantime, you've got the other candidate going as traditional as you can go. You're going on Oprah and doing, all this traditional stuff and having all these celebrities and all the normal kind of late night TV sort of stuff that's been happening for decades.
Okay, so then Trump goes on Rogan, and then he goes on Theo Vaughn, and he does all these massive audience, long form podcasts. Independently. Whether or not, I think he's a terrible communicator, but whatever, like, you like it, you hate it, don't care. The interesting part about it, all of these independent media channels have a larger audience and a more impactful audience and more nuance than any 3-minute news clip could ever have. And I, just before the holiday break, went to a shoot with a major network producer. And I had this exact conversation because I was asking her about her, I'm like, what has it been like for you guys? Like,
This is a major network.
major network news. This isn't just local news. And I had this conversation with her. I was like, what's it been like for you guys? Like, and she's like, we just don't have budget to go do these stories, and we don't really get to investigate. We don't really get to do what most producers and writers went to journalism school for, because there isn't time. Pretty much ever since CNN invented the 24-hour news cycle, it was like, oh, well, we're going to expedite this. The media landscape has changed so much that now they can't keep up because that process just isn't fast enough. What I've been most fascinated by are two things. A, the opportunity for an independent person to sort of form their own network. And I brought up golf YouTube, but it's been such a really interesting example of how this could work. And I think Adam LZ is another really good example. Those guys went and built their own channel. Adam was a BMX kid, and then went and built his channel and really got into cars and just dove in head first. But what he's done since then is expand to a bunch of different businesses within his network that are all sort of supporting each other, whether it's selling merch or the Drift HQ thing or selling sim parts or putting on his own events. I think watching independent creators not just go, I'm a content creator and I'm just going to make videos, but I am a business. I think that's where the model for traditional media lost, is because they only had one business model, and that's either sell ads or, it was really sell ads on their network and hope that people watch and that they get good ratings. I do think that's the biggest change. You're watching those guys make moves in the golf space. Another guy, Grant Horvat, that I follow really closely, he just announced ownership stakes in 2 different golf brands. And I'm like, cool, when that flips and gets sold to private equity or gets bought up by one of the big things, he's going to make a multiple. And that's a super smart business move. And so I think there's been more room for nuance, and there's been more room for people to sort of choose their own destiny. The bad side of that, you are completely dependent, unless you are diversifying, you're completely dependent on whatever platform that you're on and how that platform determines they want to pay you. Now you're hearing sort of a lot of the OG creators on YouTube go, well, that's not really worth it for me anymore to go out and spend my time and do that. So I think that it's kind of a catch-22, right? But there's always something new. And I think the folks that figured out like, oh, you have to use this platform to diversify what you're doing, that's going to be sort of the future of media. It's, an ad read on a podcast is one way, but there's a lot of other ways to sell product or, come up with your own brand or sell merch or whatever it is. So I think that's probably been the biggest shift. And the way people consume stuff. If you look at podcast ratings and, like, who would have thought Dax Shepard of all people would have the Go Away I'm Baiting guy from Idiocracy would have one of the biggest podcasts out there. So I think people are looking, it's hard to find objective truth, but I think if you can find nuance, then I think that's more attractive to people today. I think people are getting smarter.
Well, and it's interesting because I agree with you. And when I started in this business, my goal at the time was to work for the print magazines because that was the dominant form of media. And at the time, you had smart people like John Kiewicz and Jeff Smith and Marlon Davis, and these were all technical editors that were brilliant technical minds that also could write, that could take really complex subjects. Like, hey, I'm going to talk about how to adapt EFI, this is in the 90s, to your muscle car. I'm going to write an article about how to do a torsion bar suspension setup on an autocross car. And the constraint was, oh, you've got to tell that story in 6 pages.
Right, you're limited.
Maybe 30 photos and captions and a couple hundred words. That is a tough ask. That is a specific skill set. When the magazine thing collapsed, there was a couple of years there. And whether this could be bodybuilding or cars or guns or golf, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Cooking, whatever. It was all the same delivery mechanism. It was all the same modality, right? And everything is paid for by advertising. And when that went away, I thought, man, how are people going to get this information? And on the PR side, what we do, it got very hard because you went from having to work with half a dozen publishing companies that controlled, 150 magazines to there's suddenly hundreds or thousands of creators, and some have 2,000 subscribers and some have 2 million. How do you sort all that out? How do you communicate with all these people? It was very scary. It was Wild West, overwhelming, huge amount of lift, huge amount of work. And what has sort of happened over the couple of years is perfectly illustrating your point, I think. I was at a Cars and Coffee. I went for a walk on Saturday with my dog, and I realized there was a Cars and Coffee around the corner. So I'm like, I haven't done that in a while. And I guess I'm weird enough that even in my off hours, I still go to car events.
Oh, same. I go, I'm done with cars after SEMA. And then I'm like Monday.
Yeah. So I'm walking on this Cars and Coffee, and this guy pulls in an older guy in his 70s who's a retired firefighter, pulls in a beautiful 61 Chevy Impala bubble top. Beautiful car. Pulls in, parks, pops the hood. I go compliment his car, and he's like, oh, thanks. I just repowered it. I'm like, oh, that's cool. What's the motor? It's a Blueprint Engines 383. And if anyone listening follows our show, Blueprint's a client. Norris Marshall's been on the show. Neat guy. And I said, oh, you've got a Blueprint motor, huh? He goes, yeah, I just bought it and installed it over the Christmas break, and I really like it. And I said, that's really cool. Why Blueprint? Why'd you buy a Blueprint motor? And keep in mind, this guy's in his 70s. He's retired, right? This is not a 28-year-old. And it's a 62 Impala. Again, this is everything about this
Pretty specific niche.
is boomer, right? Boomer all over it, right? Retired firefighter. And he goes, well, I wanted to buy a motor, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I went on YouTube and I started watching videos, and I found this 15-minute long factory tour of their factory. And I was watching how they build all their own machines to make their own parts, to do their own engine assembly. And by the time I was done watching that video, I was so impressed, I went online and ordered the engine. So first of all, that made me feel kind of good.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's our work. I mean, it's Norris's work. We're just
promoting.
bullhorn, but I don't want to take credit for his work. It's his work. But also, could you have put 15-minute technical video content into a 6-page article in a magazine? Probably not. And I think that's the nuance you're talking about is,
And could you make it visually compelling?
and if you're willing to invest the time on the production on the front end, I think you will find people are willing to put in the time to consume it on the back end. Maybe not the first touch. Maybe the first touch is just a Google search. Oh, I've never heard of this company. I want to learn more about them. Once they go down into the funnel, I want to learn as much as I can. They're going to watch all the videos on YouTube, right? Because that's a lot of money. You're going to spend $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 on something, $10,000 on something. You want to learn about it.
What's the first thing you type in? X and X review.
Yeah.
Like I'm buying optics for my pistol, and I'm like, okay, cool. What's new for this year? I learned how to take it apart piece by piece because some guy, not a creator, some guy was willing to spend the time to set a camera up and some lighting and show people how to disassemble and assemble a pistol.
We had an HVAC issue over the Christmas break. The guy that came out to fix it couldn't fix it. And he finally said, your system appears fine. I don't know what's wrong with it. And he left. And in the meantime, I'm like, well, crap. Now what do? I just started watching YouTube videos, and I ended up finding out that I have Nest thermostats in my house. Apparently there is a known issue where they can basically stop communicating with the system. So I'm like, okay, maybe it's that. So I went to the hardware store. I bought a new thermostat thinking you just slap it on the wall. Apparently that is not the case. It is a very complicated install process with a lot of wires. I called my dad, he was in that business before he retired. He's like, yeah, just so you know, if you wire this wrong, it's going to fry the circuit board and cost you about $5,000.
Oh, cool.
I'm like, sweet. Watched a bunch of YouTube videos, learned how to do it, wired it myself, solved the problem. I could never in a million years have figured that out without YouTube. It really has become a nuanced platform, but you're right. I think the monetization thing is challenging. So now I think what we're seeing is someone will create, even LinkedIn has the vertical swipe, reel basically. They're basically essentially copying TikTok like everybody else. So now we see these creators that we work with that'll create one piece of content and they'll deploy it across 4, 5, 6 different platforms. And wherever it gets views, it gets views. And then they're aggregating eyeballs and saying, across all these platforms, I get X number of video views and I have X number of followers, and let's partner up. And I'll promote your product, or I'll demo it, or I'll review it.
I'd say probably the downside of sort of the age we're in now is really difficult to decipher truth because of the power of social and the power really of algorithms. The fact that if you want to be in an echo chamber for only things that you really want to hear, it will serve you exactly that. And even if it is totally untrue, you'll see a headline. And then how do you do your research? Who verifies that this is true? So I think there's the element of it where it's really interesting for if you're in a hobby or you're interested in a certain subject matter and you want to learn something. But there's also just as much of a challenge, I think, with lack of nuance in the same platforms.
What's the future of this whole thing?
What I see now, I think the podcast thing, like one of my wife's friends, this is just a quick sort of anecdote for this, but one of my wife's friends, her friends were complaining that they send a friend in their group videos, and then he replies back right away and like with a laughing face or whatever. And they go, "Do you even watch the stuff we send you?" He goes, "Oh no, I just slide through it just to get the gist of it." And I think the future is the attention span is getting even shorter and shorter than 30 seconds. And it is. And I go, I think we're overstimulated right now. And I think there's going to be a bit of a correction where people will sort of push off some of this stuff. I'm curious to see what kind of Gen Z and what happens next. I think there will be a point where people go, it's too much. I see too much information. I'm getting too many ads. Every platform, every other post is an ad. TikTok, Instagram, no matter where you're on. And I think people are going to get to a point, and I think it's probably as they mature, but I think it's also having a lot of effect on their frontal lobe development. So
For sure.
I'm curious. My guess is that there will be a push away because there'll be too much to do. And I think a lot of people will start, even as they get older from now, when they're teens and 20s, will take a step back at some point, just like I think a lot of us have, where we're like, look, I got about 2 hours in my day where I can really do this. It's so overstimulating that it's like, I'm good. You're not getting the dopamine hit anymore. You're not getting the thing you used to get.
You're right. And something I've noticed on my own Instagram feed is maybe 2 or 3 dozen pages I follow or people I follow because I genuinely like their content. I'm interested. They're friends, car builder, they're a fisherman or a hunter or whatever.
Sure.
That I want to see their stuff. And I'll look through my feed, my scroll, and I will look at that content. And that takes maybe 20 minutes a day at the most. But what I've noticed over the last month or two that's making me use Instagram less and less is when you start swiping, I don't know what is going on with your algorithm right now. And I even went deep into the menu settings and reset my algorithm to try and make this stop doing this. And it didn't work. Not only am I getting hammered with ads, I'm getting all sorts of really twisted stuff from other countries that are like very violent and dark, like weird, like people getting hit by trains and stuff that like, I have never once liked one of those posts. And it's, I don't know why that's all happening, but it's gross and it's dark. I don't want to see that. I don't need that kind of negativity in my life. So I'm like kind of just using Instagram less, to be honest.
I mean, you have the implementation too of a lot of like the new AI tools, and like there's so much AI content now, and some folks are using it as like, hey, look what you can make. But I think there's also the backside of that too, and it's such a way bigger conversation. That's 50 episodes of a podcast. But you are seeing like even fake humans that are now like, oh, hey, I'm a digital creator, and they're actually just AI.
But on the flip side, I think you're right about the podcasting. On one hand, the podcast thing has gotten to the point now where a lot of the podcasts that I've listened to for a long time are becoming so commercial.
Yeah, for sure.
That it's turning into network TV, which I don't enjoy that. On the flip side, like I listened to a podcast over the weekend with Lex Friedman, and he interviewed Vladimir Zelensky, which, not to get political, but to have an American of Russian descent fly to Ukraine and sit down and do a 3-hour interview with this guy who, we've all heard about him over the news for the last couple of years. I don't really know that much about that whole issue.
You only know what you saw.
But to listen to this guy spend 3 hours talking about his people, his viewpoint, now, maybe I agree with him, maybe I don't, but that could never happen on TV. And there was no commercial interruptions. It was just a very candid, I consider myself a semi-intelligent human being. I can listen to this guy and make my own judgment and say like, okay, maybe I agree with what this guy has to say. Maybe I don't. But I do think that is a new thing that hasn't really existed before.
It might be the only bullshit meter, to be honest, because like I think somebody could get their whole they could get their marketing speak and all their jargon out of the way in the first hour. But if they have 2 more hours to go, they got to be a real person at some time. And I think that maybe there's some people that could get by that, but I think it is
there's no teleprompter for 3 hours.
No, I think it does sort of take the veil away.
Yeah, so that part I think is a positive. All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We went from internships and sticky notes to the president of Ukraine. So Cory, I guess what I wanted to ask you to kind of wrap things up is the question I ask every guest, which is, as you think about your career and your time with us, but your time over your whole arc, what's the biggest mistake you made and what did you learn from it?
Thinking about things in only how they would affect me and not other people, or not a brand, or not the business. And I think it's a maturity thing. It's also, I think there's a element of that where it's like, you got to realize like it's so much far beyond how that affects you, or the risk that could have been in a moment that you were like, whoa, like Jesus, like that, I can't believe that really could really happen. And it didn't. And so I think that's probably the biggest takeaway is like, you have to think about things more than how they affect you, but in the sort of greater scheme of, it's even how you present an idea. It's how you talk about something. It's how you speak about someone. There's so much more weight that goes along with it, the higher up in a company you get, but also the amount of experience that you gain. People look up to you and respect the fact that you have learned all this stuff. So sometimes you say something, you and I have talked about this, like, speaking in absolutes, but it's not about just you, and it's not about how it just affects you. So I think that's probably just, looking at taking a much wider look about how I sort of perceive challenges, maybe how I'd approach something that I wouldn't have done, 10 years ago. I think I think having a very narrow sort of view of something is probably my biggest mistake. And the willingness to say, hey, I need help too.
That's remarkably self-aware. Cory Burns talking about open-mindedness. I like it.
I'll go start my new podcast about finding peace or whatever it is.
That's good. Last question I wanted to ask you is, for a guy who collects experiences and you look back, what was the best one?
I'd say probably this past year. It has nothing to do, it has something to do with work and nothing to do with work at the same time. I got to take my dad, and I'm sure everybody that follows me on social media has heard all about it, but I got to take my dad to play Pebble Beach, and we had talked about it for like 10 years. And it's not
during car week.
Right before car week. So I was already going to be up there for the week. I don't look at it as like, hey, this is some experience that was through work, but it was what I've done throughout my career that gave me the ability to create that experience for him. And so like for the rest of his life and for the rest of my life, I will know that that everything that I did, that was an opportunity to create that moment for me and my dad, which is like, it's something I cherish, and it's something I'm so grateful for. I've had so many, and I call back to a bunch of them all the time, but I think that one really stands out in the sense that like, it was because of this, I was able to do that. So, I think to many more of those.
That's a lovely, touching sentiment. As much as I would like to end the podcast on that, I want you to tell the story of the first time you drove a press car.
The SLS AMG had just come out. This was a convertible, and Aaron had dropped it off at our office for some reason.
I think he swapped it for something.
And he had dropped it off, and he's like, yeah, it's like our long-termer. If you guys want to put some miles on it, cool. So you and I were like, all right, let's go to lunch. And we were in Reseda. So we just drove to Panda Express or whatever. And we're going up Reseda, and this guy pulls up next to us. And, it's crazy because that we didn't really at the time, we drove some cool muscle cars and stuff, but we really didn't have access to high-end, supercars and sports cars. So to drive something like that was nuts. And this guy pulls up next to us, and he goes, hey, and we both look over at him. He's like, that's a nice car. He's like, but I bet you ain't got one of these. And he pulls up literally a rotary phone that's spray painted gold with the cable attached to it. And we're like, nope, definitely don't have one of those. And he speeds off, and I was like, only in Reseda, man.
I'll never forget that. But them fully waist up, hanging out the window with a gold rotary phone.
A weird place.
Well, on that note, thank you for doing this. It was fun. Yeah, I'm glad we finally got to have this conversation. For those listening at home, that's another episode of Only the Strong Survive with Cory Burns of Kahn Media. If you like this episode, please like, share, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to. Keep in mind, you can subscribe to the show on both YouTube and Substack for notifications of new episodes. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everybody.